Hello, everyone. I'm Noah Krachivik, and welcome to another interview hosted by the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis. Danny is having a few technical difficulties, but he will be here as soon as he can to talk to an amazing guest that we have for y'all today. His name is Wadi'h Halabi. He is a lifelong communist militant who was born in Jaffa in Palestine and moved here. I think it was almost 70 years ago now, right? 65 years ago. And went from being a nationalist to a Marxist in the Communist Party here. So we're going to talk all about the fight in Palestine. We're going to talk about class struggle in general, all kinds of stuff. And we're going to do it right after the international. All right, welcome back, everyone. Welcome, Wadi'h. It's an absolute honor to have you here with us, sir.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be on.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Absolutely. I was planning on maybe opening up with a question about your life and who you are, but there's so much there that I want to save that, and I know our audience is gonna want to learn a lot about that, but we're going to save that to the end because right now there's an incredibly important class struggle going on in Palestine. And so the title of this stream is The Liberation of Gaza by Working Class Means. So I want to begin sort of there with the basics. I very much like the sort of the framing that you use here, that liberation of Gaza by working class means. For us, I mean, this is everything. The struggle against Zionism is a concrete and determinate form of the class struggle, given the characteristics by the particular material history that gave rise to this specific struggle, right? So that's basically the Marxist way of looking at it. What is it that you mean when you say the liberation of Gaza by working class means? Is it what I'm describing here? What does a ceasefire by working class means?
Thank you. That's really crucial. So some unions in the United States and locals have taken up ceasefire. They've even come on into opposition from the AFL-CIO for raising it, but now it's gained quite a bit of momentum, and the same around the world, and sometimes the calls for immediate ceasefire. But essentially, for communists, we need to move that forward, which is ceasefire by working class means. And what does that involve? And so part of the inspiration for raising this is some tremendous actions by the Longshore Workers Union on the West Coast in past years, 2021 most recently, actually, in support of Gaza after bombing there in 2021, where there was sometimes called block the boat, but essentially actions against Israeli cargo shipping that extended up and down the West Coast with mass support. And I don't know if you're able to bring up this. I sent the link to one article among many about this action, but it just shows just the sheer number of people who came out in support of the Longshore Workers Union, which has a long history of remarkable demands and actions dating back to the 1930s. And so it's part of Longshore is one among many unions worldwide formed or transformed by the world communist movement especially the 2 decades after the victory of the Russian Revolution. So that's a small example. The idea is essentially to move not only to block the boat, to ground the planes, to stop the trains, to stop the flow of arms from world imperialism, above all from the United States, to stop that flow, to ideally stop production, transport, and really the hardest actual use of arms against the people in Gaza. So on the one hand, there's the union actions, which can be decisive, combined with mass mobilization. Like we're seeing today, we're seeing mass mobilizations. We have not yet seen significant. We've seen some union actions to try to stop that flow of arms. It needs to be coordinated, and work that I've done over some decades, actually, on the material basis for revolutionary optimism, pinpointed the potential importance of the World Federation of Trade Unions, generally of the unions formed or transformed by the World Communist Movement, but specifically the World Federation of Trade Unions, in terms of the ability to do just this, to coordinate union actions on necessary tasks with mass mobilizations. And so that's really what it means. So ceasefire, the call for ceasefire, again, was a step forward. But essentially, it's a request to the bosses to stop the shooting. And you can tell, the U.S. imperialism is actually very nervous about what's unfolding in Gaza, and is trying to get the Israeli state to be more effective and less. But so the bosses are also thinking about ceasefire. Ceasefire by working class means is a whole step forward. And
it seems absolutely crucial to me, actually, that this is how it goes. And we had a few technical difficulties before we went live today, so it gave Wadi'h and me a chance to chat for a little bit, and we were talking about the fall of the Soviet Union and other similar communist states that really, I mean, if this hadn't happened, that coordination between mass mobilizations and organized working class action would be there. And so the key for us is to rebuild that coordination that would have been provided by the old world communist movement, by this new thing sort of taking shape right now. And we need to do so on the double. But yeah, thank you for that. And I was sort of browsing that article. It was brilliant. But I think Danny had the next question. If you want to go ahead, brother.
Good afternoon, comrades, and maximum respect to Wadi'h, longtime veteran of the Palestinian liberation struggle and anti-imperialist struggles. Well, the technical difficulties, full disclosure, is because I'm marching in the streets of the Bronx. Thousands of us are marching here in solidarity with Gaza, with the West Bank, with Occupied 48. Snuck into a Palestinian and Yemeni restaurant to at least extend solidarity to our mentor and dear comrade. Wadi'h, forgive me if you already covered this. We can pivot to the next question. But I think it would be amazing to hear a little bit about how you became radicalized. Not that Palestinian people have ever had any chance, but to be radical and that they're born into resistance. But do you want to walk us through you being born in Jaffa and what became in occupied Palestine, Tel Aviv, your earlyhood, childhood memories, your first memories of struggle? I think our the youth would love to hear that.
So I was born in Jaffa in 1946, and so Jaffa was a big town, and Tel Aviv was a little village next door to it, and we were driven out along with 95% of the population of Jaffa. In Haifa, it was 98%. In May 1948, and in my case, in my family's case, we ended up in Gaza, and we eventually were able. Gaza then was a substantial number of Palestinians. I think close to 200,000 ended up in Gaza. The remaining ended up either in in Lebanon, Syria, but especially Jordan. But we ended up in Gaza, which was like a detention center, partially at the time controlled by Egypt and Britain. Egypt was still essentially a servant of Britain. Well, we ended up in Egypt, and first Alexandria, and then Cairo, and so by the time I was 5, I knew that, quote unquote, the communists had supported creating the Israeli state. That's quite significant, actually, in this whole story and my personal development. So you quickly get politicized, but our hopes turned to essentially nationalist movement, and in 1952, a nationalist officers movement developed within the Egyptian army to overthrow King Farouk, the servant of the British. And so my father was all enthusiastic about that, understandably. And and riding around the streets of Cairo, there was a demonstration against Farouk, and I joined it. I knew my father was for it, and Farouk was overthrown. So one of my early memories was actually visiting one of his palaces. You know, the officers opened that up. And so the motion by Nasser. So my childhood hero was no sports hero. It was Gamal Abdel Nasser. And then this was reinforced with war. The British, French, Israeli aggression in 1956, sometimes called the Suez War. Effectively, in part because of U.S. intervention out of fear of where the nationalist movement could go, the British, French, and Israelis were turned back. And so that seemed to reinforce the that maybe nationalism could be effective against for national liberation. However, so first, I now realize that I learned that the communists, quote unquote, had supported the Israeli state, that essentially the nationalists were using that to immunize the masses against communism. Because they did not say that, say, Lenin had a history from earliest days of his struggle exposing Zionism, even the most social democratic form of Zionism, which would fight mainstream Zionism, but would refuse to be part of Workers of a World Unite. And nor did they.
Can I interrupt you real quick, Wadi'h?
Yeah.
Because this dovetails beautifully into something we wanted to get a little deeper into, if you don't mind. So I'm obsessive about reading Lenin, right? I'm still collecting all of his collected works, as they're kind of expensive from the old Progress publishers. But one thing that really interested me in those, with my family history, my grandparents were actually Soviet Jews, was the Marxist position and Lenin's position specifically on these exact issues, right? For anyone who's not aware, or like people that have maybe heard the sort of surface level, ultra left view of what Lenin says about nationalism, self-determination, all that, this question of Zionism kept arising in the Soviet Union, especially at the very beginning. And Lenin would ruthlessly criticize anti-Semitism, and at the same time criticize the Jewish Bund for being way too nationalistic and distorting Marxism in that way, like you were putting it. Not on board with workers of the world uniting. They couldn't see a class distinction, right? So my question really, as it gets out of the Lenin era, after Lenin dies, and into the Stalin era, which is when Israel is officially created, what was the official Soviet position and what was the international's view on the creation of the Israeli state in Palestine? Can we like dig deep into that?
Yeah, let me work my way to that.
Sure.
So the Balfour Declaration, when the British first announced support for creating an Israeli state, which failed to mention Arabs. But the Balfour Declaration dates from November 1917, at the same time as the Russian Revolution, and this is also during the First World War. And as far as I could tell, the two main motivations for this were, one, that oil had proven its importance for war, and more generally, essentially for economic production, including class war. Because can raise the price of oil and automatically reduce wages and never even have to enter into union negotiations. The British had sent geologists into Palestine, and they thought the center of world oil resources might actually be in Palestine. So Birzeit means oil well, and oil seeps out of the ground, or used to in Birzeit. And in fact, if you're willing to empty the Mediterranean, you can frack and tremendous amount of oil from out of Palestine. Not a good idea. But the second reason for it, again, this coincides with the victory of a Russian Revolution, which is what halted the First World War. It was that class struggle. And a disproportionate number of Jews were either supportive of the revolution or played leadership role in it. And believe me, the British were aware of this. And so, again, even if, so Palestine at the minimum could play a very important role in the transportation of oil to Europe out of the Middle East. But again, it looks like the British thought that it might even be the center of world oil resources, and they were not far off. But there was that political side against communism, and many people do not realize that. So, if you can bring up the front page of Lenin's letter to American workers, almost amazingly, Lenin mentions or has two warnings in it. Yep, just the title, just the very top. That is all that's necessary. I can't recommend enough. So this is from the summer of 1918. So just a few months after the Balfour Declaration was published, and it contains two warnings about imperialist goals or intents in Palestine, and also in Mesopotamia, so it became Iraq. So this Lenin was truly extraordinary. And then the Comintern had an unambiguous 100% opposition to Zionism and the creation of the Israeli state. And so if you can bring that third one up, Comintern versus partition, again, just the front page from the Comintern magazine. So that's the third, I think, of the attachments I sent you.
Yeah, that one's going to take one more minute. While I'm getting that set up,
Yep.
I just had to change the format for some reason. I just want to say this is one of my favorite letters I've ever read from Lenin, and I've read a lot of Lenin's letters. It's like you say, it's prescient almost. But yeah, keep going. I'm just going to change the format on this and pull it up.
Sure. So this, by the way, I can't recommend this letter to American workers enough, because you see Lenin balancing the interests of the new Soviet state with the interests of world revolution, of liberation of all of humanity. It's extraordinary. And so if you're well worth the time. So here we go. So this is from the Communist International's magazine, November 1937, against the British plan to divide Palestine. The author, William Gallagher, sometimes it's called the Communist MP, made his way, and again, unambiguously opposed. And then we have World War II. And we have victory of revolution in Albania, in Yugoslavia, in Vietnam, August 45, in People's Korea, I think September 48, and victory of a Chinese revolution, accounting for 25% of the world's population at the time. Absolutely extraordinary, as well as the Soviet victory. And this is, again, what halted the Second World War. So the general perspective is of global class struggle. One class or the other must rule the entire world economy, and again provides a key to the road to peace, the Leninist road to peace, through prosecution of the global class struggle. That's the road to world peace. And so problematic, part of I think cost of essentially the Soviet victory and weaknesses of the world communist movement. But the Soviet leadership disbanded the Communist International in 1943. And then in 1945, moves to join the United Nations, which I call Oppressors and Oppressed of the World Unite. And I still have a few pages to read in the collected works of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, but have yet to find the call for Oppressors and Oppressed of the World Unite. And as part of making that agreement with imperialism, the Soviet leadership, it appears August 1945, agrees to support imperialism in creating the Israeli state. And then moves through Czechoslovakia, where the working class took power 2 years later, to arm and train Zionist bands, including providing them with planes. So part of behind the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians was, in particular, or not least, that use of planes, but also of small arms and so on. So, so I've had quite a few decades to think about this and tying it ultimately to identifying the decisive weaknesses in the fall of the Soviet Union and other counter-revolutions. And where we can take this is, in this case, very clear in terms of the position of the communist movement on Zionism and creation of the Israeli state. That was a settled question, that this could not serve the interests of the working class. And so effectively, the world movement had an obligation to either prevent this serious error by Soviet leaders or to move quickly to correct them. Unfortunately, I think in part out of mistaken loyalty to the Russian Revolution, most of the world communist movement fell in line in terms of supporting creating the Israeli state, which is actually imperialism putting Jews in the midst of danger. And the side of it we don't often realize is that at the same time, imperialism was blocking Jews from moving, for example, into the United States. The first ethnic cleansing necessary to create the Israeli state was not of Palestinians. was carried out by the U.S. Army and the armies of some of the victorious capitalist powers, uh, forcing Jews in Europe, still the remaining Jews in Europe, forcing them to go to Palestine. So that's a chapter many people don't realize. The U.S. Army, for example, held 250,000 Jews in displaced person camps in Europe, and the majority wanted to come to the U.S., absolutely blocked and forced to go in the Israeli state, and that taking them to Palestine. This is right after the end of World War II. It essentially was a huge boost to essentially creating the Israeli state. So the second ethnic cleansing of Palestine was what I went through, 48. But many people, then there's a third ethnic cleansing, which is of Arabs out of Jews in Arab countries. And the way that was carried out was essentially with U.S. help, but the Zionists carried out or arranged for carrying out of bombing of synagogues in places as far apart as Baghdad, Morocco, and Egypt. I was there, I think, 1954, and it was like throwing a match into whatever the right saying is, but waiting to explode, and that brought hundreds of thousands more of what became of Jews who had been living in Arab countries in many cases for many centuries to become the cheap labor and second-class citizens of the Israeli state. So this points us in particular to the critical weakness. Again, this was for a settled question. Why wasn't the World Communist Movement able to prevent or correct this error? So this should have been an easy one. A more difficult one, for example, are trade union policies after socialist revolution. Very difficult question that should have been part of an ongoing discussion, so that workers in the Soviet Union or any state created by socialist revolution really felt this was their state. And we see, like in Poland, how failure on that set the stage for counter-revolution in Poland, which really accelerated. So this is really quite important. So we have some remarkable books, for example, Socialism Betrayed, that point to the existence of a second economy, of a significant petty bourgeois production in the Soviet Union, and linked up to officials of the Soviet state. And that was a real weakness.
Yeah, and Kieran and Kenny point to it as being one of the primary factors in the fall of the Soviet Union. And from everything that I've read on it, all of the top Marxists around right now agree and are learning from that book. This is what the Chinese are currently studying, right? Is that book, and they're making new editions of it with new chapters in China. Cheng Enfu is of the same opinion, and he's, I mean, probably the sharpest guy around right now. We sort of humbly hope that we stand in the tradition of him and creative Marxism. But it's interesting to understand how all of these questions sort of pile into the same sphere, right? That we can go from the errors that cause the genocide happening in Palestine right now, and we can trace it all back to what can we have done better. And I think this is something that's lacking in the sort of wider left today, that as this new communist thing that's happening right now solidifies we need to address. Because one of the first things that communists need to do is be aware of errors and learn from them. And if we're not doing that, and if we're hiding them and trying to push the things that you were talking about earlier, such as a sort of class collaboration, then we're learning nothing and we're going to go nowhere. But I want to sort of switch gears for a minute, if that's okay. I think, Danny, you had something you wanted to ask, right?
Yeah, Wadi'h, I'm going to get back to the march in a few, but I thought it'll be important to for you to talk about the shifting international context. It's very clear that global humanity stands on the side of the Palestinian people. The entire capitalist class, the global capitalist class, their sellout minions in the Gulf kingdoms and other Arab countries, they've turned them against the Palestinian liberation struggle. So really, humanity's soul is divided down the middle, with the vast majority of people standing with the indigenous people of Palestine, but the entire capitalist system contracting to create abject misery within Gaza. We see Al-Nakba 2.0 advancing on the West Bank, over 330 deaths since October 7th in the West Bank. But with this being an election year, it's fascinating the polls that are coming out. 3/4 of young people between 19 years of age and 28 years of age here in the United States are against Biden and against Biden's handling of this genocide. They try to dress it up as a war. Every Israeli and U.S. newspaper continues to call it the Israel-Hamas war, as if every 1.1 million children in Gaza was a recruited and trained member of Hamas. And they've also obfuscated the true history of Hamas, because in 1987 it's Israeli intelligence and U.S. intelligence that pivots in order to drive a wedge in the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They want to create this Islamicist force. And if we go back and we read the reflections of the Mossad and the Netanyahus, we can see that this was a sinister design, that they planned with incredible imperial and Zionist foresight what would become. But if you could, Wadi'h, speak to young people today in the U.S. and across the world, and how has Palestine become a lightning rod for everyone who wants to fight white supremacy, Zionism, and imperialism?
So Lenin had a wonderful saying that the whip of reaction urges the revolution on. And wow, is that whip hitting? And the overwhelming majority of workers and oppressed around the world at least sense the threat as reflected by essentially imperialism is carrying out in Wadi'h, Gaza. And the question is how to get the working class back into this. And hence the call for ceasefire by working class means, liberating Gaza by working class means. Behind the fantastic destruction of Wadi'h now, but before that, essentially, again, imperialism placed first Britain and then the United States placed Jews in a trap, in a terrible trap, and it's critical that we point out and direct our fire above all at imperialism, and point out what Zionism is doing in Wadi'h is the result and fueled by imperialism. But set into this trap, essentially, essentially Zionism has long had, and this is going back more than 100 years, the goal of getting rid of the Arab population in Palestine. And part of it is by making life unbearable. Essentially, Gaza was uninhabitable before October 7th. And you can imagine with the destruction today. But before October 7th, essentially, it was a concentration camp that held 2.2 million people solely on the basis of their ethnicity. So
Can I just interrupt? I'm so sorry, Wadi'h. I want to interrupt and just really stress that this was the highest concentration of people in the entire world. And for them to be living in these conditions and this to be purposeful based on a bourgeois plan is absolutely disgusting. But go on. I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure our audience knows that.
So, among other things, just like one not minor example, through active and passive measures, Gaza's drinking and agricultural and water for agriculture were poisoned. A famous general's son, Israeli general's son named Peled, who just became disgusted by this, his estimate was that 98.5% of the water available in Gaza before October 7th was unfit for human consumption, because not only were water treatment and sewage treatment plants disabled, but the various measures have allowed seawater to seep in, and this is systemic poison. The salt in seawater is a systemic poison. So an extraordinary number of people in Gaza, even children, have such kidney damage from it that they're on dialysis, and you can imagine what they're going through now. But in the Great Marches of Return, 2018, 2019, snipers and other among Gaza's two wardens, the Israeli and Egyptian army, but snipers and other forces killed or wounded over 36,000 Palestinians, including killed 56 children. And snipers often, when they didn't kill, were aiming for the spine. So the sheer number, so that we're talking about a concentration camp with the water poisoned, with more than half the children considering suicide in the past year, according to Save the Children Foundation. So the idea was, before this, was to make so uninhabitable that people would want to go, and the aim was to push us into the Sinai Desert, where we went through on our way out of Gaza.
I want to. Can I interrupt again? I'm so sorry. I keep doing this. So two things. I just want to say that this is what the ruling class does. They make a people dependent upon their services, and then they can do whatever they want to get a desired reaction. And the strength of the Palestinian people, that they've been able to stand up to this and continually fight back, is absolutely inspiring. I also just want to say, Danny's been having connection issues all along. He's going to be going back to the demonstration. So it's just going to be Wadi'h and myself from now on. So I want to sort of stay around the marches of return right now, because they're a really good look into how the imperialists have been responding to nonviolent resistance, right? To marches, to even journalists. So could you go into the way that the brutality and the ruthlessness with which they treat any Arabs in the area, really?
So again, another term I have is propulsion by revulsion.
It's a good
So
one.
there's worldwide revulsion among workers and oppressed about what's happening, and the key now is to turn this into motion to not only strengthen the world working class and its ties with the world's oppressed, the non-working class oppressed, who make up the majority, and the great marches of return reflect overwhelming agreement among Palestinians about the right to return. So essentially, Zionism has been pushed into this box where the idea was to make Gaza uninhabitable. And if we had any doubts, we see it after October 7, but it was uninhabitable before then. Their hope was to push us into the Sinai Desert. But we also have a key, and again, this goes into that call for ceasefire by working class means, is we don't just stop at ceasefire. Gaza is uninhabitable. It must be evacuated. And the propulsion by revulsion, or the revolutionary response, is one to evacuate Gaza based on right to return and based on the struggle to end apartheid in any form across all of Palestine. So that includes apartheid not only in housing, not only in jobs. So I don't have recent figures, but say 10,000 out of 10,000 jobs in at least one utility in the Israeli state, I think 6 out of the 10,000 employed were not Jewish. I don't even know. They may have been specialists from Europe, but that gives you an idea of the apartheid. But there's even apartheid effectively in the unions.
Mhm.
So the Israeli Union Federation did not allow membership by Arab workers. That's been softened a little bit, but for example, Social Security is denied to Arab workers. It has to pass through the Palestine Authority, and that's dependent on Israeli payment of funds, which often are stopped. So this is unacceptable. So this takes us back then to the potential importance of the unions formed or transformed by the essentially the World Communist Movement after 1917, and the assessment of the material basis for revolutionary optimism. It lies in.
Before we get to
Yep.
this, because this is a question I really want to go deep into with a few questions about it. We had a couple questions from our audience that I just want to address. First of all, thank you, Georgie Mamaladze, who's a new member of the YouTube. This institution, or this institute, is completely people funded. We have, there's no altruistic Chinese billionaires who are funding us. So thank you so much, Georgie. When you join the YouTube as a member, you get access to the Discord and all kinds of great stuff. So thank you for that. Doubter asks, Habash quoted as stating it's their turn, right? So what significance has the PFLP, etc., yielded for Hamas in uniting the Palestinian resistance, a sort of jihad slash effort and class struggle converging into an Islamo-communism. And it looks like they were limited for space on their device. So if I'm translating this correctly, it's referring to when we were talking about the sort of strange bedfellows of religious fundamentalists and communists that happens around here. So I think what he's asking is if the PFLP had any significance in laying the groundwork for what we see now in communist groups, joining up with Hamas.
Right. So maybe a good way to approach this is again through my own evolution. So into basically nationalism, and then became pan-Arab nationalism through Gamal Abdel Nasser,
Mm.
and then along comes the '67 war and a defeat that essentially pointed to the inability of even the best of pan-Arab nationalism to challenge imperialism and make lasting gains. And so, despite this severe Soviet error in supporting creation of the Israeli state, what Palestinians were looking at were the tremendous achievements of the Vietnamese against imperialism, fantastic achievements of the Chinese Revolution, the tremendous achievements by this point of the Cuban Revolution, which in such a short period of time, for example, could overcome illiteracy. And in a movement very similar to what brought about the Black Panthers in the United States, the Palestinian movement moved out of a nationalist understanding to Marxism, which incorporates the necessity for national liberation, and very critically for land reform, but points to the importance, necessity for the working class to take power to make achievements like the Vietnamese or Cubans or the Chinese. The Chinese did tremendous things on national questions and language, handling language issues, and handling even the most subtle of questions facing ethnic minorities and nationalities. It's remarkable and not well known.
It really is. If you read their constitution and the protections for national minorities and the way they address them is so detailed and in depth.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's
tremendous.
It's amazing to see, and to see it all working out, and really the what they call the Chinese national harmony is beautiful. It really is.
So there have been some steps backward in recent years, and it's a source of concern. But in any event, so the Palestinian movement moves from nationalism, the best of the Palestinian movement moves from nationalism to Marxism. So this is after the '67 war. The motion is extraordinary and rapid. And by 1970, essentially, the working class is beginning to be in a position to challenge for state power in Jordan. And actually, my father's youngest brother, who had been wounded in the head in 1948, was part of that motion. And in January of 1970, he was killed, targeted killing from a plane using a U.S.-made rocket. And it turned out that the Jordanian army had provided the Israeli forces with his location. Well, that rocket basically penetrated my head
Yeah.
because what was the Jordanian army doing providing that? And basically, class comes first. That in the face of the working class moving to a challenge for power, yes, uh, uh, essentially Arab exploiters would uh, do this. And that resulted actually in a Soviet arising in some Jordanian towns, Irbid in particular, near the Iraqi border. Um, but the movement wasn't sufficiently mature. And basically, all Arab bourgeois regimes, some of them very radical sounding, combined either actively or passively to defeat the working class attempt at taking power or move towards taking power in 1970. But the best of the Palestinian leadership was able to uh, find its way to Lebanon, uh, coinciding with tremendous uh, radicalization and development of the labor movement in Lebanon, uh, starting about this time. Um, and um, um, and what followed was absolutely extraordinary and unknown in the world, is ignored. This the civil war in Lebanon that broke out, I forget the exact date, April 18th, 1975, and lasted just a little over a year into the spring of 1976, where uh, working class forces uh, first defeated the Lebanese army, effectively by splitting it along class lines, where uh, the worker soldiers came over to the side of a working class, um,
And
which left one, yeah,
that's an essential key of any revolution if it doesn't want to be, crushed immediately, is the soldiers. And we have this sort of problem in the US right now that I think results from a lot of the ultra leftism of what we call the middle class era, where they sort of write soldiers off altogether as evil because they were part of the American imperialist machine. And I don't know. It seems silly to me to go, well, if you have Marxism, you have the truth. Why not just flip them? Right. But we had another question from someone in the audience that I think this is a really good time.
oh,
But I
yeah,
want to get back into Lebanon right afterwards. So I just want to go over this quickly. Leo Sequeira asks, he thinks it would be a good idea for those who aren't aware if we explain what a working class is, because the Marxist view is a little deeper than what the bourgeois view will say, that if you make a certain amount, you're working class. If you make another amount, you're whatever. So the Marxist view of what a working class is part of a contradiction that is inherent in how production happens, right? How our society becomes society. It's private ownership and social commodity production, so social value creation, right? This gets reflected in the relationships that we need to enter into in order to produce things, right? So worker and boss, or proletariat and bourgeoisie. uh, we can get into sort of how that all changes over time and what a middle class is and all that, get into another form of exploitation, which is debt. But basically, what we mean when we say working class is those people who are sort of forced to have nothing but their ability to sell labor, and so they're forced into this relationship with those who own means of production. So you can't, accumulate or start your own business or anything like that. You have to sell your labor. Therefore, you're working class. But yeah, go on. I just wanted to make sure we answered that
Oh, yeah.
before we got back, because it's really based on, dividing the working class parts of the army in Lebanon there.
Oh, this is really crucial. And the crucial part in any capitalist society is that the majority tend to be property attached. So there are now 33 million businesses that actually file taxes in the United States. And we approach it like the Chinese approached the peasantry in China, which was a majority of the population. Some were landless peasants. Some were middle. Um, sorry about this.
Oh, it's fine. Don't worry.
So some were small peasants. Some were lower middle peasants, middle peasants, upper middle peasants. Mao came from the upper middle peasantry. My host in China took me to visit his birthplace. It was actually very interesting. And then there were the larger landlords, and so, and yes, the ruling class here, for example, defines working class by those who went no further than high school or less, and middle class as those who had more than high school, or sometimes by income. But your definition was correct, and the thing is that's huge number of more than 40% of the population that are property attached in terms of weaker business owners. We need to pay a lot of attention to that, and but to go back to Lebanon, basically there was this tremendous radicalization of workers in factories, and the leadership of it came from Palestinian who had developed in those years after 1967, and developed enormously after what unfolded in Jordan in 69-70, including the defeat and drawing the lessons from the defeat. And that included PFLP. And this extraordinary movement develops in Lebanon that first, as I mentioned, defeated the Lebanese army by splitting it along class lines. And you're absolutely right in terms of those are workers in uniforms, producing, a luxury for the bourgeoisie in terms of war, and foolish to turn our backs on that. But the last, but not minor, prop for bourgeois power in Lebanon was the Phalange, open admirers of Hitler, armed and trained at U.S. behest by the Israelis. And in December of 1975, the Phalange rounded up in front of, with the cameras rolling, rounded up quite a few Palestinians, including some quite young, I think in the Quarantina section of Beirut, and shot them. Mm-hmm. And that set the stage for defeat of the fascists.
Exactly. I really want to focus it on, because there's this sort of myth that, well, it's Israel. Why would they be arming and training open admirers of Hitler, right? Because they are not sort of driven by that sort of thinking. They are driven by the logic of capital, right? That's what imperialism does. They don't care that these guys are admirers of Hitler, even slightly. If they're using them for their genocidal aims, then they're using them.
and class comes first. Class considerations. The drive to exploit overwhelms other considerations, including, as we saw in Jordan, national considerations. The drive to exploit is that it overwhelms lesser forces. But boy, do we have to pay attention to this question of national liberation worldwide. So that massacre in December of '75 of Palestinians in front of the cameras set the stage for the defeat of the phalange. And so that now no power stood in the way of the working class no force stood in the way of the working class taking power in Lebanon in January of '76. Israeli ships, you could see them from the shoreline outside Beirut, warships ready to intervene. And the United States said, "Don't you dare." And instead turned to the Palestinian bourgeoisie and Syrian bourgeoisie to bring in the Palestine Liberation Army, which was stationed in Syria. Well, that was confusing to the masses. Palestine Liberation Army, but they're intervening to save the fascists, and that's not what they were there for. They were there to serve, to protect, to try to preserve bourgeois power in Lebanon. Well, in a matter of weeks, the Palestine Liberation Army, like the Lebanese army, got split down class lines, and its forces came over. Its rank and file soldiers came over to the side of the working class. And so by May 1976, essentially, nothing stands in the way of a working class seizing power. The formation of the Cuba in Lebanon. Again, the Israelis, well, this is the Middle East, this is oil. The leadership understood that it would need effectively defense from the Soviet Union to be able to survive. And so it requested from the of Soviet leaders to send the hospital ship to Saida, just not far from Beirut, to effectively, supposedly, to take care of the wounded on the working class side, but really to say the Soviet Union defends revolution in Lebanon. So it would have created essentially a Cuba in Lebanon, except Lebanon is not an island, and this would have transferred very quickly into Syria, possibly into Turkey, NATO country. But the Soviet leadership, after some discussion, it wasn't immediate, refused. And again, Israelis could not wait to intervene, and the US again said no, and asked the Syrian regime to intervene. And the Syrian army came over the mountains, not far from Damascus to Beirut, maybe 60 miles. And the Syrian army came over, riding, armed and trained by the Soviets, to put down working class power in Lebanon. So, and this is unknown. This war was portrayed as a war between Christians and Muslims. And this is a chapter of extraordinary importance. I sometimes call it the Beirut commune. It was really Lebanon commune, in that the working class rose to a position of power in Lebanon, but stopped short of forming a state until it knew it had Soviet support. And China was in the midst of cultural revolution and all of the difficulties, great difficulties of forming a social system. So, and of course, the Soviet Union was much more developed, and the Soviet border is not that far away. But that Soviet refusal set the stage essentially for the U.S. to have the Syrian army come in. And It was actually social democratic regime, Ba'athi, weak social democratic, and it moved to discipline the working class, and above all, the uh, 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 the Palestinian leadership. And but it was half-hearted about it. Um, there were signs of revival of the working class movement within 3 or 4 years, and this Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and the massacres in the two camps, Sabra and Shatila, near the airport in Beirut. Uh, Essentially, what the Israeli army was doing was finishing the job that the Syrian army had started, but hadn't been so thorough about doing.
Yeah, and I want to remind everyone that this was the Soviet-trained Syrian army, right? That we're talking about. Can we focus just for a minute on why the Soviets would refuse Lebanon their aid, refuse to sort of ratify, for lack of a better word, their revolution? If you don't know a lot of the deep problems going on in the Soviet Union at this time, you may go, that doesn't sound like the Soviet Union. Weren't they, fighting South African apartheid, etc.? So can we go into why the Soviets refused them for a bit?
Oh, it's a huge topic in itself and maybe worth another discussion because,
Probably.
again, I've had a few decades to think about it. But essentially, the Soviet leadership feared a revolution, feared the working class, exaggerated the strength and power of imperialism. And but this is then where fundamentalism arises. So with the defeat, effectively, of revolution in Lebanon, you have the rise, actually, of a remarkable formation, Hezbollah, which learned a lot from the military ethics and training and tactics from the working class struggle in Lebanon from 75 to the end of June 76 and the Syrian intervention. But it's a nationalist formation, and conditions for Palestinians were and remain unbearably bad for Palestinians in Lebanon. But nevertheless, Hezbollah has proved quite a force against even the Israelis, as the Israeli invasion in 1976 demonstrated. So, what is this fundamentalist force, whether it's Hamas or the even stronger Hezbollah, or even the force out of Yemen that's been, actually been the greatest source of support for Palestinians in Gaza. Essentially, it reflects the resistance of the petty bourgeoisie against the against what imperialism is doing, which has been devastating to the petty bourgeoisie. Same as small businesses in the United States have suffered enormously, 80s, 90s, and we need to pay attention to that and again draw the distinction between our poor peasants, our middle peasants, and the contradictions between them, and learn to use them like the Chinese learn to use them.
Even Lenin was talking about this, right? This is a parallel to what Lenin called the democratic petty bourgeoisie, right? I actually have a theoretical pamphlet coming out very soon on what I call reproletarianization, and it goes into this and the remnants of the middle class that are, there's two parts of it, right? There's the sort of professional white collar working middle class, and then there's the more traditional small business petty bourgeoisie. And there is a sharp divide between the democratic petty bourgeoisie here and a more imperialist, I guess, aspirational
Mm.
petty bourgeoisie. But this, I don't want to go over on time. I know your time is very valuable. So this goes actually into the sort of last topic that we were going to be speaking about today. Is sort of out of all this darkness that's going on that we've been talking about, that there is inside of it a sort of light, right? That there is at the center of this a reason, and a material reason to use your paper you were talking about for revolutionary optimism in our era. So really, I'd like to wrap up. And by the way, I'd love to have you come back on anytime, and let's go real deep into any of the subjects we were only able to talk about or touch on. But what keeps that revolutionary optimism going in an era with so much reaction around,
Right.
with a genocide going on?
Yeah.
How do you maintain that?
So had quite a bit of time with considering all the defeats that Palestinians have suffered and the masses of the world. You know, in some ways, my opinion, conditions in the Congo since 1991, coinciding with the fall of the Soviet Union, so it's 32 years now, conditions in the Congo are as bad as you'll find anywhere. There's a problem of decay in capitalist countries. What imperialism, one definition of imperialism is capitalism in its period of historic decline, which opens the road, opens the path for socialist revolution. But of course, we have to do our part. But it's been almost 50 years now since the last working class seizure of power in Laos in December 1975. And so conditions in capitalist countries make struggle more necessary, but at the same time more difficult. Not impossible. Make revolution more necessary, but more difficult. We've had some remarkable organizers and people trying to, so what is the material basis for optimism, including today? So above all, it lies in the past, in the accomplishments of the working class to date, which range from philosophy, Marxism, which provides us effectively with the method to correctly evaluate reality, including problems like this problem of decomposition of the working class, and if you're lucky, recomposition on an unfavorable basis. Or in places like Congo, although there's been some change in part because of demand from China, but basically the working class disintegrated in 1991, and people were reduced to mining, and there's still quite a bit of it. It's called, essentially you have children and people mining, by hand. It's something terrible. But they've been reduced to that. They're effectively forced to be in business for themselves. So the material basis for revolutionary optimism is, one, advances in Marxism, including the great contributions from China, from Vietnam, from Cuba. So second is, above all, the world movement that emerged from the Russian Revolution. There's something so extraordinary about the Russian Revolution and the theory, organization, and practice that came with it, that despite the fall of the Soviet Union, decisive for the future of humanity, either way, is the World Communist Movement. And so I joined the Communist Party here in the United States after the fall of the Soviet Union, because I realized, that was key help from my son, but realized that the period we're in is a period like, say, 1907 to 1923, capitalist crisis, to Russian Revolution and to war, to Russian Revolution and formation of the World Communist Movement, and it ends with the defeat of the revolution in Germany. But in between was revolution, say, in Hungary, 1919. And extraordinarily, this World Communist Movement is still, above all, centered or largely organized within what's called SolidNet.
Mm.
So,
yeah, the INCWP, and
so the Chinese party is part of it. A proposal I made in my first visit to China was, please consider at least participating in SolidNet meetings. So the official CPs are largely in SolidNet. It's not terribly effective. It's a forum for exchanging information, but the central reference point for all communist parties is, again, the theory, organization, and practice that led to the Russian Revolution and formation of a Comintern. The reference point is not the weaknesses and errors made, including on Palestine. So, second of those great material, in terms of material basis, are unions formed worldwide, many of them long preceding the birth of Marx. But there's so much to be learned from their struggles. But key, so the work on revolutionary optimism pinpointed, in particular, the unions formed or transformed by the communist parties as potentially playing a key role in terms of basically overcoming the gap that's developed between many communist parties and the masses. Hence the importance, and you showed the slides or the pictures from that struggle by the longshore workers in California in 2021 in support of the people of Gaza, and the mass support that they had. On the world scale, okay, so when the communist parties in SolidNet, between them, have about 112 million members today. It's extraordinary. Again, the reference point is the Russian Revolution, reinforced by every subsequent revolution, including that of China. But the unions affiliated with the communist parties in SolidNet have about 420 million workers in them. So, as a British coal miner once said to my wife and myself in 1978, if we just learned to spit together, we could drown the bastards. So, so the World Federation of Trade Unions has about 105 million workers in it. The other 315 million are in the Old China Federation of Trade Unions. Quite important, formed by the Communist Party 2 years after the Communist Party was formed in China. So the Communist Party in China in 1921, the Chinese unions and the Old China Federation of Trade Unions traces its history unmistakably back to 1923. And I've had interaction with leadership there. But in any case, they're not prepared to do anything. But with the World Federation of Trade Unions, what's critical is that its membership consists of both some of the more remarkable unions in the capitalist world. Examples include Portugal, include India, include Brazil, also include the union federations, say, in Vietnam and Cuba, which have a history of relative effectiveness in defending workers against their own state, if necessary, taking from Lenin, but with care in terms of unions' tasks after revolution are basically to advance working class power. And that also includes advancing development of the productive forces. Whereas, you know what happens, say, if a worker at Amazon helps Amazon develop better methods, workers lose their jobs.
Yep.
That worker may be promoted to management, but in any case, that's not our job in capitalist countries. But after a revolution, that changes. But other so on top of this material basis for revolutionary optimism, a question of there's 5 states created by socialist revolutions. That's all that's left. It's down from 17 in the mid 1980s. But one of them is unquestionably the dominant economy in the world in terms of, that's China. But other are, of course, the tremendous experience in revolutions, but also from defeats. So the more we learn, whether it's defeat of counter-revolution in the Soviet Union, or Poland, or Yugoslavia, but also defeat of essentially the Beirut commune, or defeat of the Iranian Revolution. So we have these tremendous experiences. And there are others. Another one is international labor defense. There's a tremendous achievement of the Communist Party here that can be developed internationally in terms of, say, for now, defending the people of Gaza. But there's so many other tasks.
And there's so much spontaneous dissonance just happening outside of what's already organized too. There's so much potential and possibility. Speaking of Amazon Labor Union gets organized along the lines of William Z. Foster's playbook, right?
Absolutely.
And Chris Smalls has been amazing since then. He's going down to Cuba. He's calling himself a revolutionary. There's more Amazons being organized as we speak. There's UAW is regaining militancy. There's we could go on for hours, and we should have you on with. We have a labor guy. His name is Kyle. I'd love to get you together with him at some point and talk to him. But overall, the fact is that conditions create these sort of things, right? They lead us forward, and we're entering a time of revolutionary conditions. To use your words, it's just like Russia in their pre-revolutionary era, and we're going through the same sort of phenomena.
Right. We just have to build and learn to use, those past and our existing organizations. And one thought possibility is a petition maybe from youth to the leadership of the World Federation of Trade Unions, asking it to coordinate worldwide union-backed actions in support of the people of Gaza, taking the form of block the boat. That was the call of the longshore workers, ground the planes, stop the trains. In other words, to stop the flow of arms used against Palestinians. With the right to return, refugee right to return, including those of Gaza, to their land and homes, and an end to apartheid in any form across historic Palestine. And ideally, this should be coordinated, say, with the Longshore Workers Union on the West Coast and UE, and say, with the Young Communist League here. So putting everything, propelling us on a good path in terms of one, essentially effective defense of the people of Gaza, but developing unity among unions globally, allowing us then to apply that to other tasks. example, an immediate example, is ending this war in Ukraine. But there's a million others, and so I think that could be something very effective. I've been working with some of the best unionists I've ever had worked with. Sadly, one of them died just 2-3 days ago out of UE, John Lambiase. But he understood the importance of this effort, dating from well before October 7 at the time, to liberate Gaza by working class means, and understood after October 7 the importance of ceasefire by working class means. And one guidance I try to use is from Marx. So we're not fighting to force the bosses to give us what we need. We're fighting so the working class can take what it needs. A question of power and using that guidance. And that's one of those past achievements of the working class. That's from Marx in terms of revolutionary optimism, giving us the way forward.
Yeah, that is a perfect place to end it. Thank you so much, sir.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Of course, for coming on today, and I can't wait to have you back again. There's a lot of topics to go over here, and I want to go deep into every single one of them. Is there anything else you want to say, get out there before we wrap up?
Just really to thank you for this effort, to thank Danny, and really the importance of building the Communist Party, Communist movement. I cannot emphasize enough, and so that's a struggle in itself, but that's the decisive one. So
if you're not organized, get organized. Nothing happens on its own. We got to do it ourselves. We got to take that power, like Wadi'h just said. So with that, we're going to go out the same way we went in with the International. Wadi'h, stick around until afterwards, and we'll talk off air for a minute and set something up. Everybody else, have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll see you next time.
And economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.